Ladies, gentlemen, very welcome at Front School. Every Wednesday, Front School is with you online. And on a monthly basis, we rotate. Today, you are at FSR Talks. We are talking, blah, blah, blah. But we are not only talking, we are grilling somebody outside Front School, having made research, having published something. Next week, we will discuss Fit for 55, the jumbo package coming from European Commission. Last week, we discussed women in energy. What do we do for gender balance, for promoting women? This week, to promote women will be quite easy. I just have to stop talking and to give the floor to Lucila de Almeida. Lucila de Almeida is the Front School team prepared to grill Anna Pietikainen. Lucila, the grill is yours.
Thank you so much, Jean-Michel. I wouldn't say that I would grill Anna, but I'm sure that we're going to have a very insightful conversation, talk, as the FSA talk, it's inclined to say. So it's a great pleasure for being here and to have the honor to introduce Anna Pietikainen. Anna is a policy advisor of the OECD, and the invitation we have Anna today for a very important moment, in which is the idea of discussing the OECD reports on the performance of the regulatory agencies that the OECD has been published in this last, I would say, 2 years, and it's about to publish the next one on Brazil in October. And why we decided to discuss this, since we launched the course of regulatory delivery in 2019, we had noticed more and more of our participants, most of them being regulators, mention the OECD reports as with a great reference of how to assess the performance. And we thought here, we discussed it, that was extremely important to bring OECD to discuss and to rethink it and to have a dig into these reports. And Anna, it's the perfect person to do this because she has basically leading these reports in Latin America, the one in Peru, Mexico, and the one that is about to be published in Brazil. So thank you so much, Anna, to be here. And the floor is yours to introduce, to make a short presentation.
Thank you very much, Lucila, and thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, when the invitation was presented to me, there was no mention of the grill. So I do look forward to the conversation. And of course, I look forward to also answering any questions from the audience and the people who are connecting online. So I will say a few words. First, I will talk a little bit about the work that I do generally to contextualize this. I will also say a few words about the reviews that we have carried out with, in this case, energy regulators in Mexico, Peru, and Brazil, but that we actually do carry out with other sector regulators and outside of Latin America also. And then I wanted to share some thoughts on some common themes that have emerged from these reviews. And then I think building on that, we can have a conversation around this, maybe around the methodologies as well as a follow-up of the reviews. So my name is Anna. I work at the OECD, at the OECD Public Governance Directorate. I lead the organization's work with economic regulators. So I manage a network that is called the Network of Economic Regulators, the NER. The NER brings together, I think now probably over 80, we used to say over 70, I think now we're over 80 economic regulators that have responsibilities for utility sectors. So we mostly have energy regulators around the table, but also regulators with responsibilities for telecommunications, transport, and water. And since we have this kind of cross-sectoral, cross-country, cross-regional reach, we focus on matters that will be important and interesting and insightful for all of these delegates sitting at the table. So we facilitate dialogue on issues like performance of regulators, governance of regulators, independence arrangements, for example. Of course, in a majority of OECD countries, regulators in these sectors are arm's length independent agencies. We also collect data on governance arrangements. We carry out thematic work, for example, on how are economic regulators responding to emerging technologies in their sectors, how this is transforming their work. And then finally, we carry out this type of in-depth review that we are discussing here today. And so why do we carry out this type of in-depth review upon invitation of regulatory agencies? We believe that a regulator's ability to operate effectively hinges on its governance arrangements. And our understanding of governance is quite vast. When we work with regulatory agencies, we look both externally, so outside the regulator, for example, at issues of how the role of the regulator is defined within the wider sector. What are some of the coordination mechanisms? And of course, importantly for independent regulators, what is the relationship like with the government? I'm sure that this is an important question for everyone participating in this seminar. We also look at internal governance. So for example, the internal structure of the agency, its resourcing, the way it makes decisions, the way its board, for example, works with the technical teams, as well as performance monitoring and assessment. So this is quite a comprehensive view of what happens outside, as well as what happens inside the regulator. And the purpose of these reviews that are carried out as part of the work program of the entire network, therefore, with the participation in a way of all of the members of the network. The purpose of the review is on the one hand to see what is working well and what are some good practices, maybe some innovative practices that these regulators are carrying out that are worth sharing with the wider community in the interest of peer learning, which is one of the raison d'être of the OECD. And then conversely, what are some of the areas of opportunity? What are some of the challenges where we can support the regulator in its efforts to identify strategies to attend these challenges? And here again, we at the OECD Secretariat maybe take a bit of a step back. We're the facilitators in a dialogue between peer reviewers, between members of the network and the regulator that is being reviewed in identifying these strategies and these recommendations. So that's a little bit about the general context of this type of work. Then more specifically about the work with Mexico, Peru, and Brazil. The Mexico reviews, for those of you who had time to look at them, will see that they date back a little bit. Of course, much has changed, maybe everything has changed in the energy sector since these reviews were carried out in 2016, 2017. And there the purpose was really to work with the three regulators of the energy sector. So CRE, la Comisión Reguladora de Energía, but also CNH and ASEA that have responsibilities in the hydrocarbons sector, to make sure that their governance arrangements matched their new independent status. And ASEA was a new agency that had just been created. So to support the leadership, make sure that they had robust practices. In Peru, we worked with Ocinermin a couple of years after that. I think the report was published in 2019, 2 years ago. And this was actually part of collaboration with all of Peru's economic regulators, which was very interesting for us also at the OECD, because we were able to see the whole political economy of how independent regulators fit in the state in Peru. And currently, so as mentioned, we are working with ANEL, and the launch event of the ANEL review is foreseen for the 27th of October. So I can discuss some high-level findings from the report, but the report is currently under embargo by the OECD, and we will be formally presenting our recommendations to ANEL on the 27th of October. So I wanted to say a few words about some common themes that came out from this work with energy regulators in the region. And I don't think that these are necessarily specific or exclusive to the Latin American region. Maybe some of them also apply to other areas of the world. And the first one refers to an idea or a theme that I already alluded to when I spoke about our methodology in carrying out these reviews, which is about role clarity and coordination. We find that this can be difficult area to advance in Latin American contexts, where perhaps the institutional maturity is lesser than in other country contexts. And we can see this, for example, in relationships between the regulator and the ministry. There may be cases where the regulator may actually have stronger technical capacity than the ministry. So this can create sometimes difficult or unclear status of whose role it is to do what in the sector context with regard to identifying new policy areas, with regard to identifying new actions to undertake. And the dialogue does not always work in a fluid manner or as fluidly as we would like. We also see that there's a lack of coordination generally. This coordination can be lacking at two levels, at the kind of higher policy level, but also at the more operational level. We see that there is often not enough coordination, for example, for carrying out inspections or these kinds of activities that end up actually placing quite a heavy burden on industry. And of course, it is the role of the state and regulators to make sure that burden on industry is as low as possible. So this is another area where we see that there is probably scope to improve in these Latin American contexts. But again, some of these recommendations and findings certainly apply in different country contexts as well. A second area that we found in most of our work with Latin American regulators, and not only in energy, is about autonomy in operations, autonomy in managing resources. So many times when a regulator is independent, its independence is enshrined in the fact that the source of its funding does not come from the government budget, but the source of its funding comes rather from the industry. So this is certainly true, and this is the case for the regulators with whom we have worked. But what we find is that often the devil is in the details. And it's not enough that the source of the funding comes from industry rather than from government, but what is the capacity of the regulator to manage these resources autonomously? And we have found, I think you will see this in the reports if you review them. For example, in Mexico, for both CRE, CRE, as well as CNH, there was, at the time of carrying out the reviews, there was a practice of a trust fund where funds from industry were placed. And the regulator, in order to access these funds, had to make requests to the Ministry of Finance, starting from the third year of the month. So funds were not available at the beginning of the year. And this discussion, these requests were not maybe always fluidly coming through. So this was hindering the operational agility of the regulators, as we found when we carried out the reviews. And there are similar examples in the other countries that we worked with. The third area that I wanted to highlight, and this is kind of our NER baby at the moment, so I had to put it on the table, regards performance assessment. And this is certainly something that we see beyond just Latin American regulators and beyond energy regulators, that performance assessment and monitoring is quite weak across regulatory agencies. We believe that it is a very important building block of their governance because these regulators are independent. They are unelected officials making very important decisions. Therefore, their accountability and their transparency on their activities and the results of their activities, the threshold is higher, the need is higher, the bar should be higher for these agencies. So we found a series of areas to improve these performance assessment and monitoring frameworks for all three regulators. And this is actually an area that the NER is going to be working on more next year in support of economic regulators across the board. And the fourth finding that I wanted to highlight, and this is, it's a strength, it's not a challenge, and it's not an area of opportunity. I wanted to end on a positive message. What we have found in Latin America is that economic regulators usually, this is certainly the case in Brazil and Peru, have been the front runners in introducing good regulatory practices in the public administration. So they have been the ones to introduce, for example, the use of good international practice such as regulatory impact assessment, ex post evaluation, also in the case of some Brazilian regulators, much before these were legal requirements. And in these countries, for example, the federal administration has then used the experience of economic regulators to inspire federal policy on the use of good regulatory management tools. And I think this really attests to the technical capacity of these agencies. And I think it attests also to a culture of always going beyond the requirements and a search for excellence and a search for improving ways of working and results of work. So I will stop talking now, and I look forward to the discussion, and I look forward to any questions also coming from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for your very clear and very systematic presentation. I think it was fairly presented the main findings on the reviews. But now I would start the first round of questions before moving to the second round. But I would like to start with a question that is most related to methodology, something that you mentioned in your presentation, and I use the same expression, the devil is on details, because I think it's very well applied for what we're going to discuss now. So my first question is related to the methodology used by OECD to assess the performance of parameters of the regulators. And by reading the performance of the reports, especially the report of the Peruvian regulator of Synergy, we could notice a very, very advanced governance framework ensuring a well function of the regulator. So you could see a very clear input using the same expression of the OECD methodology. So we can see an independent financing, as you just mentioned, that in the 90% of the finance of the regulated grants is coming from the industry. A clear recruitment staff based on expertise. In terms of process, as you mentioned as well, you can see we could see a use of regulatory impact assessment in the early stage, and with experience, like with more than 50 years being done already, and platforms for stakeholders dialogue consultation, including consumer boards and post-assessment. So at the best, it shows that indeed the regulators are very well equipped in terms of institutional framework governance of these regulators. But then on the other hand, the OECD parameters correctly. Now, it's not only focused on the process and the outputs, but it's mostly focused on outputs and outcomes. And this is, I think it was when you highlighted where the devil is on the details. Because by digging into the privacy of the regulators, not at the bureaucratic level, you can see that economic benefits has not been as assessed as it was as issues like bureaucratic issues with budget or number of inspections. And then here I think it's the big questions, like how the OECD identify these pitfalls in the governments. What kind of methodology OECD has used to identify that actually this, when you go in the detail, is not as good as the framework would think us or would give us an insight that is good enough?
Thanks, Lucila, for the question, and thanks also for reading the report. That's much appreciated. So it's a very good question, and I think it really speaks to the way we carry out this work. So we don't go in with a checklist and then basically run the checklist and then give it a grade. That's really not the nature or the purpose of this work. It's a very long engagement between the Secretariat and the regulator. There's a huge upfront investment on behalf of the regulator that is requesting the review, and as well as the NER team. We first of all send a long and very detailed questionnaire to the regulator. This is usually how the OECD operates. It's kind of our first wave of gathering information. We analyze the answers to the questionnaire, in addition to, of course, doing disc research on legislation, all of the corporate documents of the regulator, to try to get a little bit the lay of the land. But of course, usually all of this describes what we refer to as the de jure. So what the law says, what the policy says, how things are supposed to work. But I think we all know that there are often mismatches between what the law perhaps says or how things are supposed to work and how things really work. And this can indeed be one of the main shortcomings of a governance framework, that if there's a big gap, for example, between what is intended and actual capacity to implement and to bring results on these issues. So what we do is we complement this kind of desk research and analysis with a lot of in-depth interviews with all of the teams of the regulator, as well as with most of the external stakeholders with whom the regulator works closely across government, different branches of government, different agencies intervening in the energy sector in this case, of course, representatives of consumer associations, for example, et cetera. So really to have a wider view. And the purpose of these interviews, which we have several times, first with the OECD Secretariat, but then also with representatives of peer reviewers, as I mentioned at the beginning, so who are representatives of other regulatory agencies from other countries who will bring in their experience. The purpose of these interviews is also to build trust between us, the reviewing team, and the regulator with whom we are working, because it's really not an audit. It's not about going in with a checklist and giving a grade. It's about understanding the culture of the organization. It's about understanding the political economy within which it operates, and within that, seeing where are the main challenges of the regulator. And that really requires an open conversation. It requires an open and transparent conversation, which is not always easy, because it's difficult for us, even as human beings, to look at ourselves in the mirror and say what some of our weaknesses are. But we are able to quite often reach these sincere discussions, also because the regulators who have requested this type of review are doing it voluntarily. There's no obligation to do it. And I think you also hit the nail on the head in terms of focusing on outputs, because with governance in particular, we often see that there can be a bit of a box checking approach to having the right processes in place. For example, doing the right thing, having a policy that an agency is, for example, required to have on integrity, for example, having institutional values, et cetera, et cetera. But the question is, so what? What is the purpose? What is the results? And that is really what we are looking for when we are carrying out these reviews. And that is the direction where we are also pushing members of the network of economic regulators when we talk about this work of performance assessment and monitoring, really trying to show, so what? What is the final outcome of these corporate processes? What is the final outcome of regulatory decisions and activities outside of the regulator, also in the sector?
Wonderful. Thanks, Anna. Maybe if you allow me to go to the second question, because it would be very connected what you said about the context, the building a trust, identify and understanding the context of agencies. And one thing that I was surprised and I think was by reading the reports in the countries. Actually, it seems to me that the agencies are much more different than actually even I expected before reading the reports. I thought most of the agencies were created in all 1990s. The maturity evolved very differently depending on several factors. And one of you said it's the context. Most of them expanding the competence over the time. But what are the critical differences between agencies and the key drivers to make one agency perform better than the other one when you put them in comparative analysis?
Thank you. That's another very good question. And I think, of course, in Latin America, there is more divergence. I mean, if we look at energy regulators, for example, in Europe, there's very strong European legislation on what these agencies should be looking like. So there is no such overarching regional legislative framework in Latin America. Most of the agencies have been created in the 90s. We actually released a few months ago, in December of last year, if I'm not mistaken, my colleague Alex Durand and myself, we wrote a working paper comparing precisely the governance arrangements of 30 economic regulators in Latin America. So I'd be happy to share the link to that paper if anyone in the audience is interested to see this. And what we saw that, yes, there are differences between the regulators, but what we also note that there is convergence between Latin American regulators and what we would consider as the OECD average based on the database that we have. So there isn't any one item that truly jumps out in terms of being very, very different across Latin American regulators. And to your question on what is the one key driver of performance, again, I would go back to our methodology of working with the regulators, kind of looking at the big picture, because I think when we're talking about governance and good governance, it can be quite difficult to have a piecemeal approach. It's difficult to isolate one thing. It's kind of like the health of our bodies, right? We can work on our arms, but if we don't watch our nutrition, then what is the point of that? So that is why we also have this kind of integral approach to looking at all of the different areas of the regulator to make sure that all of the sides, in a way, of their performance are protected.
Thank you, Anna. That's great. Do I have time for another question, Jean-Michel?
I will try to, but if I'm stupid, tell me frankly, Anna. You refer to 4 sectors: energy, telecom, transport, water. How could we assess 4 different sectors like this one regarding quality of service, access to the infrastructure, affordability, innovation? How to make this concrete and not a very abstract way of assessing?
Thank you for the question. Are you referring to defining indicators for these different sectors?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question, and I think obviously it would not be the same indicators for these different sectors. And that's certainly not what we are purporting to do with these reviews. In terms of, we are not defining what should be the sector outcome of the regulator and seeing if the regulator is then achieving this sector outcome. I don't think that that's the role of the OECD. I don't think that that is the role of the Public Governance Directorate of the OECD. That is actually the role of the regulator and the government within the public policy objectives in that country. We are working, as I mentioned, we're working on looking at frameworks for performance assessment and accountability and reporting for economic regulators. And your question is very good, because what we see is that there's huge divergence in practices across countries, across sectors, across regulators, and maybe in some cases, even in the same country between different sector regulators. Some have a strategic plan with objectives, some have a strategic plan with objectives and indicators, But sometimes those indicators are not measured. Sometimes those indicators do not really look outside of the regulator. That's something that we very often see. And I think that's something that we saw in the case of Osinermin, for example, going back to the reviews that we're speaking about here today. And that's something that we would look at from the OECD, rather than being prescriptive and telling the regulator what the objective should be. Of course, that is specific to the context. It is specific to the needs of the country. It is specific to the needs of the sector, to the policy objectives that have been set by the government. But we would recommend that these kinds of external milestones or signposts that the regulator should have for itself should be there, because often the regulator may be out of comfort, because it's of course easier to measure something inside the agency than outside, where attribution is not exact. There are of course many other factors that come into play, but we would certainly recommend that regulators also include these types of measurements that you mentioned at the beginning in their strategic plan also.
Thank you. Do I stop there, Lucila?
You can go. I have one question. We have one question from the audience.
Okay, I have another one. Mexico and Brazil are two-level countries. They have provinces and the federal. How do you manage this particularity?
Sure. I mean, and Mexico and Brazil are both federal countries, but they're very different, I think, in how they approach this. In Brazil, for example, there are many state regulators for different utility sectors even. So there are many more complexities in the institutionality of regulation and economic regulation in a country like Brazil, I think, as opposed to Mexico, which maybe tends to be a little bit more centralized. That has been my impression. So how do we manage this when we are working with the regulators? In the case of ANEL, obviously we met with state regulators also to hear their opinions. We met with stakeholders of state level regulators to hear their opinions. Of course, it adds a huge level of complexity to the work, and it adds a huge level of complexity to the work of ANEL. And it is one of the areas that we look at in the review that's going to be published. And one of the areas of recommendation that we make is that this could actually be, this kind of collaboration with the state level regulators is a huge area of opportunity, because in some states, and it very much depends on the capacity of the state level regulators, because there's a lot of disparity between the different states, of course, probably linked to the financial situation, the economic situation of the states as well. So in cases where there is capacity at state level, ANEL works quite a bit with these state level regulators, which allows them to be much closer to the field, which allows them maybe to delegate certain activities and to be more efficient in this sense. So this is an area of opportunity that we highlight. And there may be scope for the Brazilian federal government to think about assessing, not just for energy, but maybe also for other sectors, assessing what are the capacities between the different state regulators, what are the opportunities maybe to create kind of equal opportunities for these state regulators to have similar approaches and similar capacities across states, because that can really be a leap in terms of enhancing the effectiveness of regulation and regulatory delivery specifically in these sectors. But it's a very good question. For energy in Mexico, we did not look so much at this level, because our work was intervening quite quickly after the major reform of the energy sector. So we were focusing quite a bit more on the changes at federal level within the public administration. But in Brazil, we very much worked on this.
Fantastic, Anna. I'm confident that the state regulators are going to be extremely excited with this recommendation to UNEL to improve collaboration, which is something that we know that is on the agenda of them. But Anna, allow me to ask one more question before going to the audience, and I will try to be brief. But it's clear that the OECD report describes the state of the art of the agents, bring a set of recommendations in a certain period of time. But most of these recommendations, they are long-term, needs to be a long-term implementation. Sometimes they are long-term implementation, sometimes they needed as well the understanding of executive and legislative bodies for making certain reforms that are necessary. But sometimes throughout this, from the beginning of from the report to afterwards, you could have political change in the context, either change of the government or some accidents or some things that could happen could affect the reputation of the agents that might affect it as well. How to implement this change. So my question to you is how to mitigate these effects of this change in the agencies, and how the OECD perceives this change in the context of the state, in the context of the expectations that these reports creates in the agencies and even beyond agencies.
Sure, thank you. That's a good question, and I'm sure it's one that's on the mind of many people listening in. Before I address the question, just a kind of methodological clarification. So these kinds of reviews that we carry out, as I mentioned, they are voluntary, and there is no obligatory follow-up on behalf of the regulator. There is no obligatory reporting to the OECD on these types of reviews. It is the case for other types of reviews where, for example, the country is being assessed on the implementation of legal instruments that the OECD has. So it is not yet the case of these kinds of reviews. Maybe that is something for us to think about for the future, but for now, it isn't. And there's only one case, which is with the Latvian multi-sector regulator, where they requested us to carry out a formal progress report, which we published just this summer. Assessing their progress with regard to the recommendations that had been made by the OECD. So what happens when there is political change? I mean, obviously, this is the raison d'être of independent regulators. The OECD says that there are certain conditions when there should be consideration, at least, of the model of independent regulators. These include, for example, the need to have competitive neutrality between state-owned and private operators. I think in the case of Brazil and Mexico, certainly there are very strong state-owned actors in the energy sector. The OECD also thinks that there should be consideration of this model when the decisions of the regulator can have significant economic impact. And I think that's very broad. And I think that's certainly the case for most economic regulators for these types of network sectors that are essential and crucial to the running of the economy. I would probably add to that also the need to have long-term, or at least medium-term, but probably today, long-term approaches. And of course, I'm thinking, for example, about mitigation of climate change. I'm thinking of decarbonization, net zero targets, these types of very long-term policies and approaches that need stability and predictability. And the reason for the creation of independent regulators, of course, is to de-link economic regulation from political cycles, which of course we know can be linked to short-term decision making. So that is the reason behind independent regulators. Of course, things can change in the context of independent regulators, and even in cases where in law there is independence in status, the context can certainly undermine the work of agencies. I think In Mexico, certainly, we have seen a very high turnover of the leadership and probably much of the technical staff, also of certainly CRE, and maybe some of the other energy regulators. I'm a little bit less familiar with that. So what happens with our reviews in that kind of context? The follow-up of our reviews in these kinds of contexts, of course, depends on voluntary engagement and discussion with agencies. In the case of the Mexican regulators, we carried out an informal progress report of the 3 reviews in 2018. Since that date, we have not been invited to carry out this kind of progress review. We have, of course, maintained contact with the regulators, but we have not been having this kind of in-depth discussion. But I think what it does highlight, of course, is that institutions can be fragile. And in Latin America in particular, when we are thinking about topics such as culture of independence, there is clearly a way to go to understand the reasoning for independent regulators, in particular, thinking about these kind of long-term challenges and long-term goals for societies and for economies of investment, for example, which of course is long-term on very, very long-term cycles. I think there are many examples, for example, from OECD countries where there have been cases where the mandate or the powers or functions of a regulator have been, there has been an intention of curtailing, for example, the powers of a regulator in a legislative proposal. And there are examples, for example, from France. I believe it was the transport regulator when there was a proposal to cut its powers in the rail reform. The president of the transport regulator published an op-ed in Le Monde outlining this plan and outlining, in their opinion, why this would hinder the performance of the sector. This is quite brave and courageous and proactive behavior from an independent regulator. And I think it also is quite illustrative of the type of dialogue that independent regulators, in a context where there is maybe more understanding of the culture of independence and maybe more maturity in institutionality across the board, the type of conversation that can happen. And I think in Latin American countries, there is a way to go to install this kind of culture of independence, both within regulatory agencies in terms of their input to policy processes and their opinions, and understanding by all parties in government and stakeholders of what their role can be. But it is obviously a long-term goal in everywhere in terms of building this culture of independence, as well as maintaining it, because it is not static. I think that is the case in all contexts. The political context can change, many things can change, and that is why regulators should always continue investing in building this culture of independence, because it is never static and it should never be taken for granted.
Thank you so much, Anna. I think Jean-Michel, the floor is yours. Would you like
Do what?
would you like to close the event?
Okay, I will not close it because as Anna illustrated, it's a fascinating area. It's very important to look at each other, and for us Europeans to look at Latin America and to understand what they intend to do, to understand what they are able to do, to understand why there are limits. And Anna has been good to show that France also have tentatives to limit the autonomy of the regulator. and it was very sensitive to me because I have a very dear friend having worked for the railway regulation, and I can also tell frankly that Daniel Schmerler in Peru was a close friend to mine, and he was a fantastic person. He's really, it shows that in many countries you find a civil servant or people working for the civil service totally dedicated to the well-being of the country and of the citizens, and it's an open issue. It cannot be closed so fast. We have to study it more, and we have to look at each other, because many things can be performed, discovered, I assume in Brazil. And in Brazil, we had an excellent partnership with a director at ANL, Thiago, and we discovered that many things that Thiago was doing, we were not so good at doing ourselves. So it's open, it's going ahead, and I do thank Anna for excellent work and for her disponibility to interact with so many different countries, because you see OECD is grouping some dozens of various countries, and OECD is now acknowledged as an expertise international group, being able to deliver many things. They also study artificial intelligence, many other things that you can discover on their website. That's the way I want to close it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna. Would you like to say a few words?
Just to thank you again for the conversation. It's been very interesting. It's always good to be grilled and pushed in our own thinking. And Jean-Michel, I agree. I mean, this is not a conversation that is closed in any way. I think it's a conversation that needs to continue. It's a very important one that needs to continue, and in all countries, I think. So I would be very happy to also continue this conversation with you in the future, and to stay in touch. And thank you, everyone. Thank you also to everyone who was following the conversation.
Thank you, Anna. And thank
Thank
you.
you, John.